My name is Daniel Holloway, and I used to believe in God. Not just in the vague, childhood way some people believe in Santa Claus or karma, but truly, deeply. I believed in heaven and hell, in sin and salvation, and in my Father, the man who preached about all of it every Sunday morning in our little Kentucky church. They called him Reverend Holloway. To everyone in town, he was a beacon of faith, a man of virtue, a servant of the Lord. But to me, he was just Dad, stern, tall, always dressed like he was on his way to a funeral. His Bible never left his hand, and his temper never left his shadow. I grew up in a house where silence was sacred, and fear was folded neatly beneath every dinner prayer. My mother, sweet and passive, moved through our home like a ghost, never raising her voice, never questioning him. My older brother left the day he turned 18 and never once looked back. I didn't understand why until much later. The first time I knew something was wrong, I was 8. I couldn't sleep, so I crept downstairs for water. The lights were off, but I heard voices from the study, a girl crying, and my father's voice, calm but commanding. God sees everything, and he forgives if you obey. I didn't know what it meant, not then, but the image stayed with me, the girl's shoulders shaking, my father's hand on the door as he ushered her out. She never looked up. Neither did I. At church the next morning, he preached on purity, on temptation, on how God tests the righteous. He looked each of us in the eye, stern, unblinking, and asked if we had sinned lately. I remember wondering if God had seen him in that study the night before. But I stayed silent. I always stayed silent. I spent my childhood watching my father from the corner of my eye, watching girls from church slip into his office after evening services. Some of them looked scared. Some just looked numb. But they all came out different, like something had been taken from them. When I was 16, I tried to ask my mother about it. Her hands trembled. She dropped the dish she was drying. And then she said, "Your father is a man of God, Daniel. Don't ever forget that." She never spoke of it again. I stopped believing that day, not in God, in him. On the night of my high school graduation, I packed a single bag and left town. No goodbye, no note. I just disappeared, like my brother had. I moved to Chicago, changed my number, and started over. I thought I'd buried that life for good. But last week, everything came back. I got a call from a woman named Susan Lyle, the church secretary back in Grace Hill. My father had died in his sleep. Heart attack, she said. Peaceful. She asked if I would come back and speak at his memorial. I laughed, actually laughed. Then I said no. The next morning, there was a letter on my doorstep. No name, no return address, just 6 words, scribbled in shaky handwriting. You know what he did. At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe someone from town trying to stir things up. But something about it, the way it was written, it felt real, familiar. That night, I couldn't sleep. My dreams were full of shadows, of the study of crying girls. So I packed a bag again, just like I did when I was 16, and booked a bus back to Grace Hill. It's been 10 years since I set foot in that town, 10 years since I walked through the doors of that house. But tomorrow, I will stand in the church where my father once preached, and I'll tell the truth, or at least I'll try, because the truth has been buried for a long time. And someone clearly doesn't want it to stay that way. They say you can't go home again, but I did. And the moment the bus turned off the highway and onto the old 2-lane road leading into Grace Hill, Kentucky, I knew I had made a mistake. Everything looked just as I remembered it: the cracked sidewalks, the faded storefronts, the diner with its home-style breakfast sign barely hanging on the window. It felt like time had stopped the moment I left 10 years ago. When I got off the bus, the air smelled like rain-soaked dirt and honeysuckle. It was oddly familiar, like stepping back into a memory I didn't want. Susan Lyle, the church secretary, was waiting for me, with the same tidy appearance I remembered. Her hair was pinned up, her glasses still thick, her voice soft but commanding. She hugged me before I could react and told me how glad she was that I came. I nodded, keeping my expression still. She drove me to a small inn at the edge of town. I hadn't been there in years, but everything looked exactly the same. Faded wallpaper, a musty smell, old furniture that groaned when you sat on it. She handed me a room key and reminded me that the memorial would begin at 11 the next morning. I thanked her and went inside. That night I barely slept. My dreams were haunted by blurred faces, echoes of crying, and a house that never let go. At some point after midnight, I noticed an envelope under my door. It was similar to the one I had received before, plain, unmarked. I opened it slowly. There was a single sheet of paper inside. The message was short. She was 15. Her name was Emily. I sat on the bed for a long time holding that note. The name Emily brought back something I had buried. A girl, quiet, with long dark hair. I remembered her sitting in the front row with her mother every Sunday. I must have been 8 or 9 back then, which meant she would have been about 15, just like the note said. My stomach turned. I remembered the night I had heard a girl crying in my father's study. Could it have been her? The next morning was cloudy. I put on my only black suit and walked to the church. From the outside, it looked smaller than I remembered. The paint was peeling, and the bell tower leaned to one side. But inside, everything was the same. The pews, the pulpit, the stained glass windows, even the scent of old wood and candle wax was unchanged. I noticed the office door at the back, the one I had always avoided. I stared at it longer than I meant to. People slowly began to arrive. Some recognized me immediately. They smiled, patted my back, told me how proud my father would have been. A few hugged me tightly, even though I barely remembered their names. There was one woman I didn't recognize, young, maybe in her late 20s, sitting quietly in the back pew. She kept her sunglasses on, even indoors, and didn't speak to anyone. Before I could approach her, she slipped out during the service and never returned. When it was my turn to speak, I walked up to the pulpit with the letter still in my pocket. I looked out at the familiar faces, the people who once called me Little Danny, and shook my hand after the sermons. They were older now, but their admiration for my father hadn't faded. They had come to honor him, to mourn him, to celebrate a version of the man I never knew. I told them I hadn't been back in a long time, and that I left to find myself. That part was true. Then I said that my father believed in sin, in forgiveness, and in redemption. Also true, but I added that sometimes forgiveness becomes a shield that hides the things people don't want to face. That was the first time I saw a change in the room. Some people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Susan Lyle narrowed her eyes slightly. I said I loved my father, but I had also feared him. That as a boy, I had seen things I didn't understand until I grew up. I didn't name anyone. I didn't describe what I'd seen. I wanted to, but something held me back. The walls of that church still had power over me. I ended by saying, "May he rest in peace," and walked off the stage. Outside, the sky had turned gray. Rain had started to fall gently as I stepped into the church parking lot. When I got to my rental car, I noticed something stuck under the windshield wiper. Another note. This one read, "You're not the only one who saw." I stood there in the drizzle, the paper soaking in my hand, heart pounding in my chest. For the first time since coming back, I realized I wasn't alone. Someone else remembered. Someone else had seen. And maybe, just maybe, they wanted the truth to come out as much as I did. The rain hadn't stopped all night. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, still holding the wet piece of paper in my hand, the ink smudged where the raindrops had hit it. "You're not the only one who saw." I must have read that sentence 100 times before sunrise. It echoed in my mind louder than any sermon I ever heard. For the first time since coming back to Grace Hill, I felt something other than dread. I felt urgency, maybe even hope. Whoever was leaving these notes wasn't just reminding me of the past. They wanted me to do something with it. By morning, the clouds had begun to thin, but the streets were still soaked. I left the motel with one goal: find someone who remembered, someone who might finally talk. I started with the obvious. The public library was quiet, almost too quiet. Mrs. Garner, the librarian, recognized me immediately, though her face tightened when I walked in. I asked her if the church had ever been involved in any investigations, complaints, even rumors. She shook her head too quickly and said, "Your father was a man of faith, Daniel, a real shepherd to this town." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. From there, I walked through town, past the diner, past the school, past the house I grew up in. The shutters were closed, the paint peeling, and the mailbox stuffed with junk mail. No one had lived there since my father passed. It looked hollow, like a place full of whispers and forgotten things. I didn't know where to go next, so I went to the cemetery, not for answers, but to feel something, anything. My father's grave was fresh, the dirt still soft. The headstone read, "Reverend Charles Holloway, beloved pastor, faithful servant of God." I stared at it for a long time. I don't know how long I stood there before I noticed someone else. A woman, standing a few rows away, umbrella in hand, staring at another grave. She didn't move until I turned to leave. Then she spoke. "You're Daniel, right?" I froze, turned slowly. It was the same woman from the church, sunglasses now off, revealing tired eyes. There were faint lines around them, the kind carved by years of pain. "I was hoping I'd run into you," she said. "I didn't want to approach you yesterday, not there." I asked her name. "Rachel," she said. "Rachel Lind." The name struck something in me, though I couldn't place it right away. Then I remembered Emily's best friend. They were always together in Sunday school. Rachel was a year younger. That's why I hadn't recognized her fully grown. She looked down at the grave next to her. "Emily Jordan, she's buried here." My chest tightened. "She died in 2008, Rachel continued, "not long after your family left town. Suicide, at least. That's what they called it." I didn't speak. I couldn't. "She came to me once," Rachel said, crying. "Told me she couldn't go to church anymore, that something happened in your father's office. She didn't say exactly what, but she was different after that. Afraid of everything, even herself." I asked why she never told anyone. "Because no one would have believed us. He was the Reverend Holloway, and we were just girls." There was a long silence between us. The only sound was the rain hitting the umbrella. Then she said, I've been leaving you the notes. I didn't know how else to reach you, but I thought if anyone could bring this into the light, it was you. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. But instead, I asked the only question I could manage. Were there others? Rachel nodded. I think so. There were always whispers. Girls who stopped coming to church. Parents who moved away suddenly. Nothing ever confirmed. Just buried things. That night, I returned to the motel with a heaviness I hadn't felt in years. But also a strange clarity. This wasn't just about my father anymore. It was about Emily, Rachel, all the girls who had vanished quietly into the cracks of a perfect little town. I pulled out my notebook and wrote down everything Rachel told me. Every name I could remember. Every face that haunted me. And then I opened my laptop. There was something I hadn't done since I arrived. I looked up Grace Hill Baptist Church online. To my surprise, it still had a website, polished, updated. There was even a new pastor, a young man named Brian Keller. But that wasn't what caught my eye. There was a tab labeled Youth Programs. I clicked on it. My blood ran cold. Underneath the cheerful descriptions of Bible camps and Sunday school, there was a photo, a group of girls, teenagers. And standing behind them was a man I recognized instantly, not my father, but Deacon Mark. He had served beside my father for years, always quiet, always watching. I had forgotten about him, but there he was, older, grayer, still involved. I stared at the photo until my vision blurred, because suddenly I realized not everything had ended with my father's death. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the motel window, watching the fog settle like a blanket over Grace Hill. The lights from passing cars sliced through the mist, but inside, everything was still. Still, but heavy, like the entire town was holding its breath. I couldn't stop thinking about the church website, about the photo of Deacon Mark with those young girls, smiling like nothing had ever happened. My father was gone, buried with his secrets, but the rot had survived him. Mark was still there, still involved. I thought about Rachel's voice trembling as she said, "There were others." I thought about Emily's name on that gravestone, the soft dirt, the unanswered questions. How many other girls had come and gone through those church doors, carrying their trauma like a second skin? As the sun began to rise, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this end with whispers and old letters. The truth was bigger than my fear now. It had to come out. I got dressed and walked into the early morning haze. I stopped at a hardware store and bought a voice recorder. Then I waited across from the church. At 7:45 a.m., right on schedule, Deacon Mark arrived, just like the staff page had said he would. He walked toward the side entrance like he'd done it 1,000 times before. I stepped into his path. "Deacon Mark," I said, "it's Daniel." He paused, expression unreadable, then gave me a stiff nod. "I remember you. I need to talk about my father, about Emily." His face didn't change. He glanced at his watch. "I have a meeting." "I know what happened," I said. "Others do too." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Not guilt, calculation. Then he stepped around me and disappeared into the building. That was it. That was all I needed. His silence said everything. I went back to the motel and sat down in front of my laptop. I opened the notes I'd been keeping, the letters, the screenshots. Then I turned on my webcam and began recording. I didn't read from a script. I just spoke. I told the story from the beginning, about what I saw as a child, the crying girls, my father's sermons about sin and purity. I talked about Emily, about Rachel, about the letters. I showed the church website, the photo. I pointed directly at Deacon Mark and said, "Wentz, this man is still around children. Then I uploaded the video. At first, nothing happened. Then the views started climbing. By the end of the day, thousands had watched it. Comments poured in, some supportive, some shocked, some angry. But more than anything, there were stories. People began writing their own experiences, private messages, confessions. One read, "It wasn't your father, it was Mark. I never told anyone." Another, "He hurt my sister." She never spoke again. I realized this wasn't just a story. It was an open wound. And I had torn off the bandage. 2 days later, a local news station called. They'd seen the video. They asked for an interview. I met the reporter outside the church. I showed her the notes, the messages. I told her everything. She asked why I had come forward after all this time. I told her the truth, because no one else did. That night, Rachel called me. Her voice was shaking. "They're digging behind the church," she said, "by the old storage shed." I got there as fast as I could. Police had taped off the area. A small crowd had gathered. Officers moved slowly, carefully. They found something. Bones. Not just one set, 3. 3 shallow graves behind a place where children were once told to go and pray in private. Grace Hill wasn't quiet anymore. The investigation is still ongoing. The church has shut down its youth program. Deacon Mark is gone, vanished. His house is empty. His car found abandoned outside city limits. No one knows where he went. As for my father, his name has been removed from the church's website. His headstone was defaced the same night the news broke. Someone spray-painted "monster" across the front. No one tried to clean it. I didn't either. I went to the cemetery one last time and stood in front of that grave. I didn't feel peace. I didn't feel vengeance. I felt nothing. Just the cold wind and the memory of a girl with dark hair, sitting quietly in the front pew, who never got to grow old. I don't know what justice looks like anymore, but I know what silence sounds like. And now, finally, it's broken.